lesson is full of them today. In fact, the entire passage seems to hinge upon one particular question. A question that, as Luke tells us, was intended to put Jesus to the test. When I read this passage, I imagine the lawyer standing up in the midst of the crowd that surrounds them, his very presence demanding attention. The exuberant chatter of the 70 others who have just returned from their mission in the towns and villages slowly fades into the silent, oppressive waiting. He clears his throat. "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" he asks with a certain slyness in his voice that makes Luke record the fact that he was putting Jesus to the test. Even if this question is intended as a test, I can't blame him for asking it. It is the type of question upon which entire identities are built, because the answer to this question could change the way he is to live in the world. The reality is that the answer to this question is what will ultimately define his fate, his ability to live in the eternal, life-giving presence of the God in whom he trusts. His intentions behind his question may not have been honorable, but it is a valid question nonetheless. Questions. Our lives are also full of questions. Questions about what we will do, where we will go, who we will be, and what we will believe about ourselves, each other, the world, and God as we attempt to discover the answers. What I find most fascinating about our questions, though, is that they point us toward something. Maybe it is our deepest desires. In some cases, it is our greatest fears and doubts, but in all cases, our questions point us toward how we are to live in this world, being the type of people we want to be, the kind of people God calls us to be. So once again, we find that our answers to these questions are exceptionally important. The lawyer in this beloved passage knows this, obviously, but he's not the only one. Jesus, also standing in the midst of the silent crowd, looks at the expert in the law of Moses and responds with a question of his own, like Jesus is known for doing. It seems that Jesus is much more concerned about how the lawyer views the world, though, than he is about answering his question. "What does Torah have to say?" Jesus asked. The two men stared at each other, and the tension rose as all their weight with great anticipation of what will come out of the lawyer's mouth. Then suddenly, in a stroke of creative brilliance, the lawyer stitches together two pieces of text about loving God and loving your neighbor and offers his answer to Jesus. In fact, it is precisely the right answer. Jesus seems to think so anyway. So Jesus says, "You are correct. Well done, good and faithful law observer. Here is your A+, a gold star, and bragging rights among all of your friends. Keep going about your life and business the way you always have, never letting what you just said actually change you." Well, that's not actually true, is it? It would make being a person of faith a lot easier, though. No action required, just the right amount of knowledge. But that is not our faith, because it is an easy faith. At least not our faith the way that Jesus seems to see it. "Do this, and you will live," Jesus says. You have found the right answer, but it alone will not lead you to the path you are looking for, the path in which you continuously live in the presence of the God whose love will define your entire existence. If you are trying to find that type of life, you must go and do. Now, if I were the lawyer, I think that my question in response to this would be much longer and have much more self-righteousness involved in it, and I would say something like, "Hold up, Jesus, let's get some clarification here. There must be more to it than that. Sure, I know that loving God is wholeheartedly is a must, no exceptions, but loving my neighbor in that way is not surely what you can expect of me. They may be bound together by the same verb, but there has to be some sort of boundary around agape, some sort of fence around love like that. There has to be some sort of people for which sacrificial love is reserved. Because surely you don't think I can love everyone that way. If I tried, my entire way of relating to those around me would be changed. So Jesus, I need you to clarify. Who has a claim on me and my resources? Who must I see? Who are the ones I am to love? Who counts? And just who exactly, in your own words, is my neighbor? And it is because of this question that we are given one of the most beloved parables of all time. My assumption is that most of us, if not all of us, in this room have heard it before, possibly more times than we can ever actually count. We know about the man who is traveling down the road from Jerusalem to Jericho. We have heard about the danger that he would most definitely face down the steep and treacherous road, full of narrow passes that are filled with countless bandits. By now, even if we have never visited this place, we know what is going to come next, don't we? It is no surprise to us when he suddenly falls into the hands of those robbers who beat him within an inch of his life, strip him of everything he owns, and leave him in a ditch to painfully live out his last few breaths. I imagine him lying there, vulnerable to the hot desert sun and the dry desert wind that continuously blows sand into his bleeding wounds, as he begins to remember the things that matter most to him in life. His pain is searing and blinding. His breathing becomes more labored. He is dying, and he knows it. Yet somehow he still hopes for the sound of friendly travelers who might just see him and have mercy upon him. Slowly his hope begins to fade because it has been far too long and no one is coming to rescue him from his pit. Then just by chance, a priest, a person who had been expected to help him, a leader of his people, walks towards him. The priest sees him, naked, wounded, vulnerable, and bleeding. He sees the man and passes by on the other side. In the same way, a Levite, a helper in the temple, just happens to be making the same perilous journey down the same perilous road, and upon seeing the man, passes by on the other side. Now, before we begin a tirade against these two individuals, we need to remember that they were busy people, bound by schedules and duties. They are indeed going and doing, but maybe that is exactly where their problems begin. Perhaps they are so busy about going about their lives that they never truly see the man. The wounded man, hoping to be saved from the effects of the brutal, violent acts of others. What remains of his life is in their hands, and perhaps that is far too great of a burden and obligation for such busy, important, well-educated people to stop for. So their decision is one that keeps them from coming in contact with another human life. Instead, they choose to pass by on the other side. There he is again. That was all I could think to myself as I looked at the man I had passed by nearly every day on my way to work that summer. That particular day was a little different, though, because I had never really had a reason to stop and look at him before. And to be honest, the only reason that day was any different was because of the red light that had imposed itself upon my progress to work that morning. As I stared at this red light in extreme frustration, blaming it for my inability to leave for work on time, of course, I saw the man. And as I looked at him, it became clear to me that he had been caught up in a boxing match with life and was beaten pretty severely. His body was hunched over in a way that made him look as if he was carrying a burden that was far too much for him to bear. His hair was white and his hands were wrinkled. He grasped a makeshift cardboard sign with 4 words on it. That was all. Somehow this man managed to use only 4 words to describe his entire condition to those who frantically drove past him day in and day out. It read, homeless, hungry, please help. I couldn't help but continue to look at this man. And the very next moment, his eyes peered into mine, and I knew I had a decision to make. A decision to respond to what I had just seen, or to continue on my way as if I had seen nothing at all. So I turned my head, I looked at the traffic light, I waited for it to turn green, and I went upon my way. What I could have actually done for this man, I truly don't know. I did not come close enough to him to actually determine that, but if I am sure of anything, it is that I was not a neighbor to that man, because he would have been far too great of a burden for me to have actually seen. Therefore, my world, with all of its obligations and boundaries around love, remained intact. Thankfully, however, there is good news for the man left to die in the ditch. There just happened to be a 3rd traveler on the road that day, making the same perilous journey from Jerusalem to Jericho. We know him as the Good Samaritan. In fact, we have heard him called this so many times that I think we often forget that we are the ones who have created that title. We have looked at his actions toward this dying man and declared them as good. But I am almost certain that the original audience would have understood him as a stranger in that land. But even more than that, he was definitely an enemy. He would have been considered unclean, seen as an outcast, and a heretic. And let's not forget to mention that he was the result of marriages between the northern kingdom and the Assyrians who had conquered them. A half-breed, if you will allow me to say so. Yeah. Obviously, he will not be the one to stop and help this dying man. There is no way that this enemy pagan could understand the way in which God has called his people to live in the world. Well, the unthinkable happens, right? The Samaritan walks toward the man. He sees him, and he is moved to do something other than pass by on the other side. It is the Samaritan, the one located outside of the people of God, who knows what it means to do love, to be love in a world full of broken, wounded, and vulnerable people. It is the outcast and the heretic who understands that the love of God and the love of neighbor are so intertwined that to place a fence around agape is to miss everything about it. It is the Samaritan who comes near the naked man and lifts him from his ditch so that he can clean and bandage his wounds. The Samaritan does not care that the man whose life hangs in the balance is not one of his own. The social, political, and religious boundaries are nothing where their common humanity is concerned. So he puts this nameless, bleeding man on his animal and takes him to a place of refuge where he can continue to be cared for. The cost of resources and time do not matter. The value of another's life is never seen as a burden because he has been given eyes that truly see. And it is only by seeing that he can begin to do the kind of extravagant things that love will make you do. So which of these three were a neighbor to the man, Jesus asked? The one who showed him mercy, all of us concerned with finding the right answers responded. Then go and do likewise, whispers the one whose cross will show this extravagant love to the world. Go and do likewise.
All right.